everybody, thank you for joining me for Business Studies Grade 10. Right, we are continuing with our topic, forms of business ownership. Previously on the topic, we spoke about sole traders, we spoke about partnership, close corporations, and a bit of profit companies. Remember, under profit companies, we have 4 types of profit companies. We have a private company, personal liability company, public company, and a state-owned company. So previously we spoke about a private company and a personal liability company, which are more or less the same. The main difference is personal liability company, the directors there are jointly and severally liable for the debts of the business, meaning that they are unlimited liability. And also the name of a personal liability company ends with INC, which means incorporated, but for a private company it ends with a PTY Ltd, which means proprietary limited. So today we want to talk about the other 2 profit companies. So we are still under profit companies, but we are talking about the last 2 profit companies, which is a public company and a state-owned company, right? And then our last lesson that we're going to have this week, we'll talk about the remaining non-profit company and cooperatives. Alright guys, remember also, when you're talking about forms of ownership, you only need to know 3 things that are very important for all these forms of ownership. You need to know the characteristics, and you need to know the advantages and the disadvantages. Those are the 3 most important things that we usually ask you in the test and exams. Each and every form of ownership here has got its way that can help you identify it. Close corporation, we say guys, at the end of the name, usually for any close corporation you see a suffix CC, which means close corporation. For a private company, you know that it's a private company because of a suffix which is PTY Ltd, which means a proprietary limited. That's how you know that it's a private company. For a personal liability company, you know that it's a personal liability company by a suffix INC at the end of the name, which means incorporated, right? So now we want to talk about the public company and state-owned company. Right guys, before I go there, I just want to explain to you a little bit about shareholders and shares, so that when I talk about public companies, it becomes easy for you to understand it, right? Shareholders, if you still remember, I said those are the owners of a company, right? You are called a shareholder once you buy a share in a company. Sorry. Once you buy a share in a company, now you become owner of a company. You are called a shareholder, right? So what happens to companies is that when a company is being formed, they have shares. Shares means ownership of a company, part ownership of a company, right? So there are a lot of shares that a company will have. They can divide those shares into different numbers. You can have 1,000 shares, you can have 100 shares, any number that they've decided to have in that company. And those shares, they represent ownership of a company. So please, whenever we talk about shares, it means ownership of a company, right? So what happens now is a company then will take those shares, which are ownership of a company, and then sell them to people, right? The reason why they do that is because they want money. Company on its own without money cannot be able to operate, so it needs money. So what is going to happen is the company will sell that ownership to investors, right, to people with money. And those people with money, they will buy the shares because they want ownership of the company, so that they can become owners of the company. And the company is going to receive money from those investors, and then they can use that money as capital to run the company, right? So that's what we really need to understand about what are shares and what are shareholders. How does one become a shareholder? That kind of knowledge, you need to understand it very clearly before we go into detail. So a company will have shares which are ownership of the company, right? And then those shares they are sold to the public, or they are sold to people, right? We call it issuing of shares when the company is selling shares to people. We call it issuing of shares. So the company will issue shares to people, and then people or investors will buy those shares so that they can have ownership of the company. So once you buy the shares, you are now called a shareholder, and now you are the owner of the company because you have bought the ownership of that company. So the more shares you buy in a company, the more ownership of a company that you have. The more ownership of the company that you have. So that's why, therefore, if you have a lot of shares in a company, it means you have a larger percentage of ownership in that company. If you have only few shares that you have bought in that company, you have less ownership of that company. That's what it means. So make sure, guys, you understand that concept of shares and shareholders. You become a shareholder when you buy shares in a company, right? You buy shares in a company so that you can become owner of that company, if you want to be an owner of a company, right? So what happens now, if you still remember now, to private and personal liability companies that we spoke about, is those shares in private and personal liability companies, they are not sold, or they are not issued to anybody in the public. They are only issued, or they are only sold to certain individuals who they want to become owners of the company, right? But now when you talk about public companies, those shares are sold to the public. It means to everybody, to any investor, whether a foreign investor, local investor, any person with money and who is willing to invest his money in the company and wants to become owner of the company can buy those shares, right? So that's what happens when it comes to this concept of shares and shareholders. And it's one thing that is differentiating a private company to a public company. Okay, let's go to a public company now. What happens to a public company? A public company, sorry, I just went up there, let me just go back. Right, a public company, it is a company that is registered to offer or to issue its shares to the general public. Right, that's the main difference between a public company and a private company. A private company is registered, of course, but it issues its shares only to private individuals, but not to the general public. Right. But a public company, it issues its shares to the general public. Right. What? Here we mean that a public company is allowed to sell its shares to investors in the public by actually selling its shares through the market for shares, right? In South Africa, the market for shares is called JSE, Johannesburg Securities Exchange, right? That's the market for shares. That's where companies can go and sell or issue their shares to the public or to investors in public. So if you go to Johannesburg Stock Exchange, you can see all the number of the shares that are there that are being sold. You can buy them if you want, so that you can become one of all those companies that have shares there, right? But for a private company now, they cannot sell their shares on JSE. This is a public market for shares. Shares cannot be sold anywhere else. There is a market for shares. Therefore, public companies, they go to that market for shares, which is the JSE, and sell their shares there to investors or to the public, to the general public. Therefore, that's why it's called a public company. It's a company for the public. It's a company for people. Why? Because a lot of people, the public, has bought shares in that company. They've bought ownership of that company, right? But a private company does not sell its shares to the general public. It only sells its shares to private individuals, to only private investors, right? That's why it's called a private company. That's the major difference between a private company and a public company, right? Let's look at the characteristics now. Since a public company is a company for the people, it's a company for the public, these are the characteristics that it's supposed to have in order to establish a public company, a one person is required to start a public company, which is similar to private company. So it means you can start a public company and start to sell the shares on JSE, right? You can do that, right? It requires 3 or more directors. This is now important. Please remember these numbers. When it comes to directors, 3 directors are required. When it comes to shareholders, 3 or more shareholders are also required. What about a private company? Private company only needs at least 1 director and at least 1 shareholder. But a public company, it requires 3 directors as well as 3 shareholders. Please remember those numbers, they're very important. This one is exactly the same. The companies will be registered with the Register of Companies, and you draw up an MOI, Memorandum of Incorporation, which shows all the details about the company, right? And also the name of the company of a public company should end with LTD, the letters LTD, not Pty Ltd. Here it should be only LTD because it's a public company, right? It has a legal personality. Remember we spoke about legal personalities before, meaning that it is registered on its own name, it is a separate legal entity, and it can operate under its own name as an individual, right? That's separate, that's a legal personality. Please, if you don't understand this word, go back to the previous lessons that we did, and I have explained in detail what are legal personalities, right? A public company also raises its capital by issuing shares to the public. It issues shares to the public. Remember, when you say issuing shares, we are saying it's selling shares to the public. That's how they raise capital. If a company needs money, a public company, it takes its shares and sells them to people. So people are gonna buy ownership of the company because they want to be owners of the company. The company is gonna receive money from them that they're gonna use, to develop and grow the company, right? And also a prospectus is issued to the public. So when you want to issue shares to the public as a public company, they use a prospectus. People, they just don't say, okay, there's a new company there, let's go and buy shares there and become owners of that company. No, people, they need to know, is it viable? Investor needs to know whether it's viable and it's a good decision to go and invest in that company and buy shares in that company. So a public company, they actually develop what is called a prospectus. It's a small booklet that has got all the details about the company and what it wants to achieve, what is its goals, what does it want to become, and all those kind of things. And that prospectus is issued or is given to the public so that when they read it, they can see the need to invest in that company or they become owner of that company, right? So it helps to market the company in other ways, right? That's what is called a prospectus. A private company, guys, does not use a prospectus. Why? Because it doesn't sell its shares or issue its shares to the public, so there's no need to have a prospectus, right? Another characteristics: shareholders have limited liability. We spoke about limited liability before, now we understand it, right? And another characteristics is a public company should hold an annual general meeting. It means this is a meeting that is done every year. That's why it's called annual general meeting. It means every year the company is required to invite all the shareholders, the owners of the company, to come and sit down, and then they can have a meeting with the directors of that company, and the directors will be explaining how the company was being run and everything that was happening in the company, right? Before, okay, about this AGM, let me go back and also explain how it works here, guys. Remember, we have shareholders now. We spoke about shareholders, which are owners of the company, right? What they do with these shareholders is they are just owners of the company. They don't run the company. These shareholders, they actually, in the AGM, the annual general meeting, they elect what are called board of directors. It means they vote and they elect, just like how we elect a president in South Africa. They also elect directors, and these directors are the people who are responsible for running the company on day-to-day basis. So they elect people who are going to run the company for them, which are called directors. And then these directors are the ones who are responsible for running the company for them. So shareholders, they don't run a public company. They're just owners of the company. They just put their money there, and then they sit and relax. And what also they do is they elect people who are going to run the company for them while they're relaxing at home, doing nothing. Right. And these directors are the ones who are going to run the company on behalf of the shareholders, the owners of the company. Right. So at the end of each year, they organize, these directors, they organize what is called an AGM. This AGM that we are talking about, the annual general meeting. In that annual general meeting, they will be reporting back to the owners of the company, the shareholders, about what was happening in the company. That's what they will be reporting about. The board of directors will be reporting about what was happening in the company to the shareholders, who are the owners of the company. Basically, they need to report, they need to account for what is happening in the company. Good examples of directors are CEOs. We know CEOs, we know chief financial officers, CFOs, COOs, chief operations officers. These are examples of directors in a company. They are elected by shareholders to run the company on their behalf, right? And this board of directors, of course, they can appoint. They don't now elect, they appoint managers in the company who can run certain departments: finance managers, marketing managers, departmental managers, and functional managers, things like that. That's how a company is structured, basically. So a company has got shareholders on top as the owners of the company. This one, they just own the company, they don't run it. This one, they then elect a board of directors in the AGM. That's when they have that annual general meeting, so that they can elect people who can run the company for them. And then this board of directors, they're going to run the company on behalf of the shareholders. They don't own the company, they just run it for them, right? They're employees actually for the company. And then these ones also, they can appoint managers and stuff when they're running the company. That's how basically a company is structured. Okay, but for private companies, it's possible that the shareholders can become the directors. For a personal liability company, the shareholders are also the board of directors. It should be that they are the same. The shareholders and the directors are exactly the same people. They own the company as well as running the company in a personal liability company, right? There's no difference there. Right, moving forward. So now we understand a public company is required to hold an AGM, annual general meeting, whereby they can report to the shareholders. The directors are reporting to the shareholders about what is happening in the company and all those kind of things, right? And the financial statements of a public company should be audited. It's compulsory that they should be audited. Audited, it means they hire auditors who can come and check those financial statements if they actually truly reflect what is happening in the company, right? And they give their opinions. Yeah, so more like certifying the financial statement, right? And also, the last thing, profits are shared in form of dividends in proportion of the shares held, right? Like what we said in private company, the more shares that we have, the more dividends that we're going to have. Remember, dividends are a share of the profit of the company, right? When the profits of the company are being distributed to shareholders, they are called the dividends, right? So we need to remember those words. The impact of public companies, what are the advantages? Major advantages is legal personality. The business has got its own legal identity. It stands on its own. It's separate from the owners, right? So it means it can do everything on its own name. It can sign contracts on its own name. It can register on its own name. It just operates like a normal person. You have an ID. The company has got a company registration number. You also open accounts. The business also, since it's a separate, it's registered on its own. It can also open its own account in the bank. It can employ its own people. It can do whatever on its own name. It doesn't need the names of the owners, right? And also, a public company biggest advantage is it is easy to raise funds. It's very easy to raise funds in a public company because the shares are issued to the public. Investors can come and actually buy shares in the company, right? Shareholders also have limited liability. It means they're not responsible for the debts of the business, right? only the money that they've invested can be the only money that can be used for the days of the business, in case the business goes into bankruptcy, right? They can appoint also a knowledgeable public companies. Have the advantage that they are a big and large scale companies, and therefore they can actually appoint, or they can elect knowledgeable and experienced board of directors, people with knowledge, people with experience on how to run big companies. So that's a big advantage, because those people, they know how to run a company. There's a high chance that the company will be successful. And the buying and selling of shares is free. It's done freely and it's easily, because it's done on the market for shares, which is the JSE, Johannesburg Stock Exchange, right? So also shareholders can sell and transfer their shares freely if they don't feel like they don't want the shares anymore. After buying the shares on a public company, you don't want them anymore, you can sell them and another person can buy them. You understand? So it's easy to transfer those shares and to somebody else if you don't want to be a shareholder of a company. The biggest disadvantage is that disclosing of financial information should be disclosed to the public, so that public can see what was happening in the company. Disclosing financial information, it's confidential information, it's a disadvantage. Competitors can see and use it against you, and large amounts of funds are needed also when actually you audit your financial statements. Auditors are expensive, and that's money that you're spending in public companies, right? In stocks or shares, you have to be traded publicly. Stocks, it means shares of the company, you have to be traded publicly. It means when people see, so people, they see the price of the shares, how many shares that they can buy, stuff like that, right? And a full report must be submitted to major shareholders each year. Yes, they have to be given reports of what is happening in the company, which is a lot of people, and it's a very expensive and difficult to establish a public company. It requires a lot of legal requirements. There are a lot of things that you need to have. A certain amount of money. You need to go to company registers and register a company. You need all those kind of things that they need. It's a lot and it's difficult to register, to establish a public company, right? And also, there's no limit on the number of shareholders there. So it means you can have as many shareholders as, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of them. And once there are too many, then less profit that is going to be given. Dividends are going to be less. Those are the disadvantages of public companies. Thank you very much. Okay, talking about state-owned companies, like the word state-owned, it means government-owned company. State, it means government. So these are government-owned companies. So a state-owned company has the government as its major shareholder and falls under the Department of Public Enterprise. Right, guys, we will need to know who is the Minister of Public Enterprise in South Africa. Right, guys, you're gonna have to give me an answer for that in your classroom. Right, these businesses take a role in the commercial enterprise on behalf of the government. So basically, state-owned companies, those are companies that are owned by the government. Right, you become owner of a company if you own more than 50% of the shares. Right, then you become owner of the company. It doesn't mean that you are the only owner. You can have other owners, but if you own more than 50%, you are basically the majority owner of the company. Right, what are the characteristics? Just like a public company, there's no difference here. 3 or more directors are required. In terms of directors, there should be 3 or more, but shareholders can be only one shareholder, which is the government only. Or more, they can be more, right? Should be registered with the register of companies. Remember that through memorandum of incorporation. That document, guys, you need to remember it. What is MOI? Memorandum of incorporation. Document used when the company is being registered, which contains information about the company. For example, duties of directors, shareholders, number of shares that are there, and all those kind of things, right? It is owned by the government and operated for profit. Actually, yes, just because it's owned by the government doesn't mean that it's not operated. It's operated for profit. They should make profit, those state-owned companies, and the name of the state-owned company should end with SOC, meaning state-owned company. Public company is only LTD limited. State-owned company should be SOC. That's how we know that it's a state-owned company. Right, and then the state-owned companies support private business by providing infrastructure. Good examples of state-owned companies are Eskom. We know it supplies electricity people, post office, we have South African Airways, we have Transnet, right? Those are good examples of state-owned companies. They are owned by the government, right? Please do not confuse state-owned companies and government departments. Government departments are not companies, they're just departments which are used by the government to run the country. Is that okay? Department of Labor, Department of Transport, blah blah. Those are not companies. When you mean companies, we mean things like post office, we mean Eskom, we mean Transnet, right? Those are good examples of state-owned companies. Is that okay? Please don't lie to me or don't give me departments. No, departments are not companies at all. Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, so the main idea behind state-owned companies is that they should provide essential and basic services to the public at an affordable price. That's the main idea behind state-owned companies. The government sometimes feels like they need just to provide those services to the community or to people at an affordable prices, and they want to eliminate duplication and manipulation by private companies. So therefore, that's why they end up owning those companies, and they can provide services that are affordable. And also another reason, so that they can build infrastructure that is beneficiary to the public and not only to certain individuals. So that's why they have those companies as well, right? What are the advantages of state-owned companies? They offer essential services which may not be provided by the private sector. Good example is Eskom is providing a very important service of electricity to everybody in the country. Remember, just imagine if electricity was provided by private companies, it was going to be expensive and unaffordable. So that's why they provide those essential services, so that everybody can afford and everybody can have access to them and everybody can benefit from them, right? And also the profits that are made from state-owned companies, they are used in other state departments so that the whole public can benefit. Prices are kept reasonable. That's an advantages of state-owned companies. They provide reasonable prices. Look at post office. If you want to send your stuff through mailing, post office is the cheapest. Electricity that you get from Eskom is the cheapest that you can get. Is that okay? Look at Transnet, PRASA. Is that okay? Rail company, they offer reasonable prices for their transport as compared to if there were any private transportation by rail, right? And it reduces duplication of services which might waste resources a lot. Is that okay? Yeah, so just for now we don't only have Eskom as the only provider for electricity, and it actually helps us to be sustainable, right? Because those are very scarce resources, right? And also it generates income to finance all the social programs that can help everybody, and it creates jobs, right? Public and state-owned companies, they create jobs for people, and people at least they have something, right? The major disadvantage is poor management of those kind of companies. They are managed poorly. That's why you see South African Airways now is closing because of poor management, right? And they are very inefficient, they are very slow. Is that okay? In providing services. Look at public hospitals, look at Eskom, the way that it provides electricity. It's very inefficient. Why? Because they are too big. They are too big and they're too complicated, and it becomes difficult to provide essential services properly, efficiently, right? And also they often rely on government subsidies. Of course, they are always often relying on the money from the government. Look at South African Airways, they have always been given money by the government all the time. Eskom is always given money by the government all the time for it to survive. So they're always relying on the government. So if the government not end up not having money, it means they're in trouble, right? And also another thing, the government loses money through those businesses, because sometimes even though they are meant to make profit, they don't make profit most of the time. You understand? Because they offer price at low price, their prices are too low for them to make profits, stuff like things like that, right? So those are some of the disadvantages for state-owned companies, guys. For any questions, please, you can ask me on the group or on WhatsApp. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me. There's an activity that I'm posting now that I want you guys to do. I'll see you next time. Next time we're gonna be talking about non-profit companies and cooperatives. So far we have spoken about all the other profit companies, all the 4 profit companies: private company, personal liability company, public company, and state-owned companies. We've spoken about sole traders. We've spoken about partnerships. Right, those are the things that we've done so far. Right, thank you guys. Have a good day.